Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Oh my God, you're so quiet. Very good. My name is Michiel Koolman. I'm the co-chair of WorkplacePride Foundation Board. And so on behalf of WorkplacePride, a warm welcome that you came here on this beautiful day at this pretty nice setting here at Leiden University. WorkplacePride, of course, is an organization dedicated to LGBT workplace inclusion at work. And it's an organization that has seen actually an enormous growth over the last couple of years. I can remember it was just a few years ago that we had 80 members. And I now look at Christine. I think today there are 125, right? And that growth is, of course, a beautiful significance that companies, organizations, universities take LGBT workplace inclusion seriously. And that a bit in contrast, of course, what is happening outside our world, because our queer community is under attack, not only in the US, but also here in kind of democracies in Western Europe and around the world. So very good that people have a sense of belonging and safety at work. We have different communities at WorkplacePride, and I see some representatives of Young at WorkplacePride sitting there. We have Tech at WorkplacePride, we have Trans Plus at WorkplacePride, and of course Academia at WorkplacePride. And I'm happy that I'm coordinating that together with Christine, and of course we are hosting you here today together with Jojanneke. Also there, we've seen growth in membership. So it was only a few years ago that Erasmus joined, that TNO joined, Utrecht University joined, the University of Applied Sciences from Utrecht joined. Christina is giving me hints. Yeah, I got them all. And also Radboud University is, I think, our most recent member that joined. So also there a commitment, I think, from universities and science organizations to LGBT workplace inclusion. And we did a few weeks ago, we had a strategic retreat for the board, and we looked a bit at our landscape. Yeah, in a company, you would call it a competitive landscape, but here, of course, we look at like-minded organizations. And what kind of jumped out is what is unique for WorkplacePride, that we are so well anchored in the academic community. Well anchored because we have academia at WorkplacePride, but of course we also have our chair, Jojanneke van de Toorn, who is going to give us an amazing program here today. And I think I can give the floor to you, Jojanneke. Thank you.
Thank you, Michiel. Also on behalf of Leiden University, a very warm welcome. Very excited to see so many of you here. And also so many online. We have 120 people online, so that's really wonderful, I think. We will also have a recording in case you want to view it again afterwards, or for those of your colleagues who did not attend today. And if you do not want to be in this recording, then please don't sit in the front row. Everywhere else is fine. Also, Christine takes some pictures today. If you do not want these pictures to perhaps end up on the social media of WorkplacePride or me, then also let me know and we will make sure not to use those pictures. It's absolutely no problem. It's just very hard with so many people to take pictures around you. If you want to communicate about the symposium, then please also include Universiteit Leiden, WorkplacePride, or LGBTIQ+ inclusion. That was the welcome by Michiel. And then just a little bit of a program. So we have two keynotes today, a longer one by Teri and a short one by me, just keeping you updated on what my PhD students are working on, and a wonderful panel that will be moderated by Jojanneke Moore. And we close with another inspiring closing, actually the opening of the academic year by Michiel. So, meeting tips. If you ask questions, that's of course no problem, but raise your hand and please also be respectful. I see some empty cups. We're not actually allowed to drink here, but I didn't see it. Just make sure that you bring it back downstairs and don't leave it in the room afterwards. That would be really great. It's also pretty hot in here. I think we already opened the window. This is a challenge every year. There is water there for the participants, but if you need to leave the room because it's too hot or you need to go to the toilet, don't hesitate. Just do it and please return. Then the keynote speaker. I'm super happy that you're here, Dr. Teri Kirby. an assistant professor in psychological sciences from Purdue University. We have actually not collaborated yet, but we read each other's work, and I'm always very inspired by it. My students are inspired by it, and so we're super happy to have her here to share insights. I think the impact of your work is very apparent. In academia, what strikes me most is your work on the unintended consequences of D&I policy and the explanations for these unintended, often negative consequences through psychological mechanisms. So really showing how important it is to take the impressions of individuals and groups into account when looking at D&I effectiveness. And so she's had a tremendous impact also on practice and what organizations do in this realm. So without further ado, please, a round of applause for Dr. Teri Kirby.
Get this set up for a short person. I'm just gonna block my face a little bit, that's fine. Just saying the bathroom in my areas, I have to do this to reach a towel rack. It's every time I come to the Netherlands. So thank you so much, Jojanneke. It's so nice to be here today and to be able to talk a little bit about some of our new work today with you. Just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rhetoric we use to talk about DEI as kind of a starting point, and what happens when we shift over time in how we talk about DEI, especially from the perspective of marginalized groups like the LGBTQ community, what happens for them when we shift our focus. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why people engage in these processes. So why are some of the reasons we might see shifts over time in our DI focus? Are there sort of positive or negative implications of this? So specifically, I'll talk about our motivations for broadening the definitions of diversity, as well as motivations for focusing on belonging and inclusion. And again, thinking about what the implications of those shifts might be. So to show you what I mean by this, I want you to take a look at this Washington Post blog. So the Washington Post says, first there is diversity, then inclusion. Now HR wants everyone to feel like they belong. So what are they talking about here? They're talking about how originally we were focused on diversity, and there was a shift. There's a shift in what it is that we want to focus on. We see this in other ways as well. This is a blog that says, everyone is diverse. Always remember that you are absolutely unique, just like everyone else. So what's the underlying message here? The message is that when we talk about diversity, we're actually talking about everyone, right? So everyone has some sort of unique individual characteristics that might make them contribute to diversity. Now that makes a lot of sense, right? Because when we think about the everyday definition of diversity, that's what we mean, right? You have to have groups. Individuals within that definition have to differ from each other, and that is diversity, right? But what we want to think about is not just sort of what we mean in everyday language when we say diversity, but what have we meant historically when we talked about diversity? Now, certainly in the US and UK, I suspect in the Netherlands too, but I know a little bit less about the history in the Netherlands. When we started talking about diversity and diversity initiatives, what we're really talking about is the perspective of marginalized groups. We were talking about things like the queer community, how to make sure we have more diverse representation of those particular groups. We weren't necessarily talking about everyone when we were talking about DEI initiatives. So in essence, this is kind of a potential conflict of who really counts as diverse? What do we mean when we say diversity? And does it matter what we mean? So we think that definitions of diversity might be broadening to go beyond the original rhetoric where we were focused on marginalized group members. And there's some evidence from 2001, 2011, talking both anecdotally in the UK and quantitatively in the US saying, oh, actually the way we talk about diversity might be changing. Part of what they're seeing is that the number of marginalized groups included in diversity was changing, so it was moving beyond a shift or a focus on race and ethnicity. But also what they're seeing is that things like personality characteristics were starting to be more included. So what's happening here is that there are potentially two primary ways we might define diversity. It's a slight oversimplification, but the organizational psychology and management literature, and to some extent the social psychology literature, tells us that there are two primary ways to think about this. So we might talk about social category, demographic, or sometimes called surface level diversity. So this is things like demographic groups, like gender, race, ethnicity, the LGBTQ community. And that can be contrasted with things like viewpoint diversity, deep level diversity, so things like personality, occupational characteristics like skills that might help you do better in diversity. So I'm going to contrast these sort of two definitions of diversity today and what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to call this a demographic, so again, race, ethnicity, gender, the queer community, versus a broad definition of diversity. Now, the choice to use the word broad is really intentional because I'm taking a more historical lens where I say, historically, in many countries, diversity was focused on demographic diversity, these group-based characteristics often that are protected from discrimination in a lot of countries. As opposed to broad, meaning we've broadened that definition to include other characteristics, any sort of individual characteristic that might matter to a person. So is broadening more inclusive? Well, yeah, of course it is, right? If we broaden the definition of diversity, we're including more people. So by definition, we're doing something potentially inclusive, right? But what we were actually interested in is the perspective of marginalized groups. So would a broadened definition of diversity feel safer for groups like the LGBTQ community? Now, we know from the literature that group-level identities are important to people, so any identity that you hold is going to be important to you, but this is especially the case for minoritized or marginalized groups. Okay, so it's especially important to them that their identity is valued. They tend to hold that identity more strongly within their sense of self and how they see themselves. We also know that people tend to like group identities that allow them to feel included in that group identity, but also feel differentiated by that identity, right? So people prefer groups where they think, oh, okay, I'm definitely a part of this group, but this group is small enough that it differentiates me in some way from other groups. Now, diversity as a term isn't exactly an identity, right? But it turns out people do have differences in how much they see themselves as a diverse individual. So we find, for example, that Black Americans are more likely to associate with themselves with the term identity than white Americans are. So in a sense, the term diversity almost could serve like a little bit of an identity for people. And so we think that if diversity encompasses everyone, that could mean that it's not serving the same need, and might make marginalized groups feel less like the idea of diversity is being tailored to them and to the issues that they face. So when we ask whether or not broadening is more inclusive to, for example, the queer community, we think it might not be, because we think that it's going to downplay these demographic identities to focus on other characteristics, but also, perhaps more importantly, downplay the role of power dynamics and how we construct diversity, right? So in essence, it puts prejudice and discrimination concerns you might face based on your marginalized identity in the same category as every other individual characteristic. So being an introvert is just as hard as being a Black American, a queer person, right? So that's what it could do when we broaden the definition of diversity. And that's part of what we wanted to ask in this research. So we thought it might actually feel like it detracts from the original intention of diversity initiatives, again, taking the historical perspective on what diversity initiatives were formed for, which was to protect oppressed groups from discrimination, facilitate their inclusion. So we want to look at whether or not it seems like it's diluting diversity, watering it down. It's unclear what diversity means. So to look at that, in general, what we wanted to do is look at these different definitions of diversity. So a broad definition of diversity versus a demographic definition of diversity. But we also looked at a combination. So for example, definitions of diversity that have mentioned both broad characteristics and demographic characteristics. One thing to note is I keep using the term broadened definition, right? So I would see the broad definition and this sort of combination definition both as a type of broadening of the definition of diversity, right? So again, if we go back to this idea that historically diversity initiatives were focused on demographic characteristics, then adding extra individual characteristics would be a broadening. But you could take that broadening even further to say, okay, we're actually not going to mention demographic characteristics at all. And I would almost see that as an extreme broadening, because it is including everyone. It's really broad in that sense, but it's completely excluding demographic characteristics from the definition. Okay, so again, I would see both of these types of definitions of diversity as a potential broadening, and we wanted to understand how marginalized groups would see that. So we asked members of the LGBTQ community, do you see these different definitions as potentially sort of watering down, diluting the idea of diversity? And then we asked about things like, okay, how interested would you be in working for an organization that has this type of definition of diversity? And especially important for the LGBTQ community, who asked about things like, would you disclose your sexual orientation? Would you disclose your identity at this type of organization? Because we know that people in the LGBTQ community, they face a lot of issues about whether or not to come out or not, right? It's hard for them to decide in an organization, okay, do I want to express my identity or not? So again, we wanted to understand, do these different definitions affect their willingness to express their identity? Now to start, we first wanted to see, are definitions of diversity even broadening? We said there's some old evidence suggesting they might be, but we wanted to look at what's going on more recently. This is contextualized within the US, so we looked at Fortune 500 companies in the US to see what's the rhetoric around diversity. So we had Research Assistants code the top 250 companies, so the 250 largest companies, for what definition of diversity they use. So we basically went on the internet, looked at all of these web pages. Most organizations have some sort of diversity web page at this point, certainly in the US. So that allowed us to say, okay, where is the diversity statement? Now let's extract that diversity statement and look at how they're defining diversity to just kind of see what's happening over time. So we looked at this for both 2014 and 2020 to also see, okay, is there a broadening over time? Okay, so I've already said this, but just to make sure I'm being really explicit about what I mean about the definitions of diversity. So with demographic groups, we're really focusing on groups that tend to be protected from discrimination in a lot of countries. So things like ethnicity, race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, ability or disability, status, age. So these types of characteristics would be the demographic definition of diversity. A broader definition of diversity would also include, or exclusively include, these more individualized characteristics, so personality, skills, life experiences, background. Now, this isn't fully always apparent, right? So if you say background, you could mean something to do with your background that's demographic, but if the statement was vague about exactly what they meant, then that got characterized as sort of the broad definition of diversity as well. And then, of course, some organizations might have a combination definition, so the broad plus demographic definition of diversity. Okay, so what do we see here? I'll focus on 2020 because it's the most recent data. We were surprised, actually. So almost 50% of these organizations weren't mentioning protected demographic characteristics at all, which was a much higher percentage than we were actually expecting. So this means the LGBTQ community, gender, none of these characteristics were even mentioned in their main little blurb about what they think about diversity. Another 37% had a broadened definition, but they did at least mention demographic characteristics, which is probably good to at least mention it, right? Only 15% had this more traditional definition of diversity. As far as we could tell, of course, sometimes the statements are a little bit vague. We don't know for sure how they define it, but only 15% had a statement that was focused on protected characteristics. And this has changed over time. So where we see the movement is in the broad definition. So what's happening is that between 2014 and 2020, there's been an increase in the number of broad statements that aren't at all mentioning demographic characteristics. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but if you're interested, what's generally happening is that organizations that didn't have a diversity statement at all previously now have one, but it's a broad definition of diversity, which I think tells you something, but I won't get too much into that. And just to give you a real-world example, what does a broad statement look like? So this is an organization called Marsh. They say colleagues are our most valued asset. Diversity of thought, opinions, and skills set Marsh apart and help enable us to improve the services we provide. So it's quite vague as well, in my opinion, but what you see here is that they are saying things like thought, opinions, and skills, and we suspect what they're saying here is deliberate, right? We suspect that they're meaning to exclude demographic characteristics here. I'll tell you why I think that later. So what we wanted to do next is say, okay, well, we know there's a shift in the definitions. What are the implications for marginalized groups? So going back to this model, I'm just going to show you, so we had 4 studies here. I'm just going to show you one study as an example that was with sexual minority participants, so people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual. So we had 275 sexual minority participants from the US. They were majority bisexual, then lesbian, then gay. And this is an experimental design here. So what we wanted to do is randomly assign participants to either read a broad definition of diversity, a broad plus demographic, or a demographic definition. So they'd see a web page that looks like this. So it might say, we define diversity broadly, appreciating diversity of thought, style. So kind of similar to the example I showed you before. The demographic would say, on the basis of race, ethnicity, age, gender. We still say the word broadly, even though this isn't the broad definition, because it's weird to say we define diversity narrowly. That just sounds a little bit negative, right? So we use broadly, even though this isn't our broad definition of diversity, because we want a little bit of ecological validity and not to get a reaction for strange reasons, right? Another thing we did in this study is we wanted to get a better idea that this is really about the definition of diversity and not just about your specific group being mentioned. So we actually, in this particular study, didn't have any reference to the LGBTQ community. So it's not just that you, as a queer person, are seeing that information about your own group. It's potentially about the actual definition of diversity. And then other people would see a combination of these 2 websites, essentially, where it's a broad plus demographic definition. So what do we find? So we asked about this idea of diversity dilution by asking questions like, this organization has lost sight of the original meaning of definition, a bunch of other similar questions like that. And we found what we expected. So we found that the organization is seen as diluting the definition of diversity more if it's a broad definition of diversity, compared to as if it's a broad plus demographic definition, which is seen as diluting it more than if it's a demographic definition. And we see similar things when we ask about diversity commitment. So they're less likely to think the organization is committed to diversity if there's a broad definition or a broad plus demographic definition. But again, the broad plus demographic is kind of falling in the middle here. When we look at willingness to disclose your sexual orientation, there's actually a slightly different picture going on here, though. What we find is that it's really the broad organizational statement that stands out. So this broad definition of diversity is making people less willing to disclose their sexual identity relative to both the broad and demographic definition. So the broad plus demo and the demo definitions, they don't differ from each other, even though they look a little bit different. There's actually no difference there. It's the broad statement that's really hurting willingness to disclose sexual orientation. Okay, so we're finding that sexual minorities, also people of color in the US, although I didn't show you those data, they see the broadened definition of diversity as a dilution of its original purpose. This only hurts interest in identity disclosure if it's broadened without the demographic, without mentioning demographic characteristics at all, however. So I think that's really important to note. We think there's a little bit more we need to do to understand this. It might be that if you have, you mentioned broadened characteristics as well as demographic characteristics, you might still think, okay, well, I think that my group is actually still a priority here. You've at least mentioned demographic characteristics. But we have to understand a little bit about why we kind of have that discrepancy with diversity commitment and dilution, as well as interest and then sexual orientation disclosure. The reason I said the thing about there could be something intentional going on here, we also don't know that for sure in terms of knowing that these broad definitions mean to exclude marginalized groups, but we haven't been able to get information about sexual orientation, but we do have information on the representation of people of color in those same organizations. So actual organizations in the real world, we found that organizations with broad statements, so actually any of this broad type of language, it's associated with lower representation of people of color, suggesting perhaps that is less of a priority at organizations that don't explicitly have a demographic definition. Yet these are the most common approaches, right? So if organizations are really interested in thinking about, okay, how do we increase the representation of, make people feel included if they're from a marginalized group, they have to think about how they're defining diversity and how that's going to be processed by those groups, because the most common approach isn't necessarily going to be appealing to people from marginalized group backgrounds. So I always pick on Google. I've been doing it for many years now, because Google gives me all kinds of examples for the things I want to demonstrate. So this is an example of a statement from Google where I think we can see this exact phenomenon. So I see that Google is really focusing on differences. So we want people who have a broad range of attributes, experiences, and points of view. We believe our differences make us stronger and produce better, more innovative work. Now, I think what's notable here is that, again, it's focused on diversity and difference. This could potentially be called a multicultural, identity-aware type of statement, but is it really, right? Because if your focus is on diversity and difference, but you don't specify what you mean by that, or you're focusing on these more individual characteristics, you might not actually be so focused on making sure marginalized groups feel included and represented at your organization. So we would almost argue that this could be a form of colorblindness. You're saying you care about diversity and difference, but you're actually kind of erasing marginalized groups. Now, there are a lot of different definitions of colorblindness, as at least a few people in this room know. But one way that people define this idea of colorblind or identity blindness is minimizing diversity to focus on similarities. Now, what we're seeing here is not a minimization of diversity, right? They say they care about diversity. So again, it doesn't fully fit the idea of identity blindness necessarily, but we think it might be a sort of more hidden way to enact identity blindness. And that's sort of what we wanted to understand next. So my amazing PhD student, Jojanneke, has been doing some work to get some preliminary idea of what are some of the underlying motivations here. And we essentially wondered, is identity blindness an underlying motivation for why people would opt to broaden the definition of diversity? So we wondered if anti-egalitarian beliefs actually underlie this tendency. So if you have anti-egalitarian beliefs, you then might also be interested in minimizing things like LGBTQ identities. So that might lead you to endorse identity-blind belief systems as well. And then that might lead you to broaden the definition of diversity. Not everyone, but just kind of looking on average at what might happen. How much time do I have, Jojanneke?
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so here we had nearly 500 straight white undergraduates in the US, 68% women. And what we did is ask them about anti-egalitarian belief systems. So that would be things like an ideal society requires some groups to be on top and others to be on the bottom. We also asked about identity-blind belief systems. So we should treat citizens of this country as Americans and not as members of particular ethnic, religious, or sexual communities. And then we asked about the ways they define diversity through asking about who should be included in different initiatives, as well as just asking them in a more straightforward way, how do you define diversity? What do you consider to be diversity? But I'll focus on what we found for the initiatives. So we did this in a similar way as what I've already told you. So we had them essentially say, okay, what groups do you think should be included in sort of a space that's for students? So a place that's meant to help diverse students feel included in the organization. Also things like who should be included in this mentoring program. And so they could essentially, it was kind of like a checkbox, so they could essentially check which group should be included. And then we recoded those into a non-demographic definition of diversity. a demographic, but we had an extra bit of information here. So it can be a demographic identity, but not necessarily be a minoritized or marginalized identity, right? So you could say a demographic group, but it could be, oh, this should be for white Americans, right? So we wanted to code for that as well. And then we also looked at disadvantaged demographic groups. So that's the group, again, part of the original definition of diversity. And we found sort of what we expected. We found that anti-egalitarian belief systems were associated with having more identity-blind belief systems, so kind of trying to erase the importance of marginalized group identities, which is then associated with a lower tendency to include disadvantaged demographic groups in the definition of diversity. Notably, it was also included with adding more non-demographic characteristics and more advantaged demographic characteristics. So you were also more likely to say that, for example, straight cisgender people should be included in the definition of diversity, should be included in these initiatives. Okay, so I'm gonna jump through that because I know I'm running out of time. We also wanted to look at the same idea, but looking at other types of rhetoric shifts. So I've talked a lot about how we can broaden the definition of diversity, but might we also change our rhetoric in other ways? And I showed you that Washington Post article. Okay. No one, okay, there we go. So this one said, first there's diversity, then inclusion, then belonging. So we wanted to ask some similar questions about what's going on when we talk about inclusion and belonging. Are there some similar motivations from shifting our focus? No one wants me to talk about belonging and inclusion. Okay. So when we're thinking about motivations for belonging initiatives, so Seval Gundamir is actually here in the room, and she has a recent paper talking about how in HR circles, this is a really common quote. I think she has thoughts about that, but I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. So this is the idea that, Seval's like, stop talking about me. Diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. And that's important, right? So the point here potentially is that diversity isn't enough. If groups don't feel included, they don't feel like they belong, you can't just have diversity. You're not going to keep people at an organization if they don't also feel included and like they belong. And that's really important, right? So I don't want to suggest here that that's not really important, because we know that belonging and inclusion is crucial for the queer community, but we also know everyone has a strong need to belong, and it is really important. We do all want to need to belong and feel included. So belonging initiatives are probably going to feel broadly appealing to everyone, even if the original intention of that initiative might have been for a particular marginalized group, like the LGBTQ community. And we already have some preliminary evidence suggesting when you use more belonging and inclusion rhetoric, dominant groups do feel more included in that. They feel more like that's about them than diversity is. That's perhaps unsurprising, but we wanted to at least see that that was the case. So they do feel more like, oh, belonging, inclusion, that's about me. Diversity, oh, that's not as much about me, right? So this gives us a preliminary idea about who feels like belonging and inclusion is about them. We wanted to quickly see, okay, is there a shift in belonging and inclusion? And we found that yes, there is. In 2014, there were 136 references, and the data already showed you, to inclusion, 139 in 2020. That's a 42% increase. So that's definitely a big increase in the extent to which we're talking belonging and inclusion. Belonging wasn't mentioned at all in 2014. Now it's mentioned 29 times, which isn't very high, but it's a big increase. And to give you an idea of this, so here's a statement that does mention belonging and inclusion. It sounds nice. Inclusion is about having a culture that embraces and appreciates differences. That's nice because belonging and inclusion is nice, right? Everyone experiences a sense of belonging and has the opportunity to be their best. Do you notice anything else about this statement, though? Does anything jump out at anyone? Other than just the reference to belonging and inclusion? So part of what jumps out to me is that this is also potentially a broad definition of diversity. So it's a bit vague. It says we care about unique differences, but it doesn't mention demographic groups. So we're kind of seeing that again here. So we wanted to understand if a broadened definition of diversity might be associated with using belonging and inclusion rhetoric And we think broadening here is potentially a proxy for looking at identity blindness in the organization. Okay. So what we find here is that there's no difference with whether or not it mentions inclusion versus not, but here's where we see the big difference. So if the organization mentions inclusion, it's also more likely to have a broadened definition of diversity. This is a notable difference here. So we're looking at the number on the x-axis. So we are seeing that broadening is more common when an organization also mentions inclusion. We also see that there is a lower representation of people of color when an organization mentions inclusion, suggesting this idea that with belonging inclusion, the focus might not actually be on marginalized groups. And then what we also looked at is what are the potential underlying motivations, and then I'll wrap up. So we wanted to understand, is this also about identity blind beliefs? Or is this something maybe that isn't quite as pernicious as that? Is there something to do with just needing to belong, right? You need to, belonging and inclusions are about belonging. You need to belong, so you want to feel like you're a part of belonging versus inclusion. So we looked at people's tendency to focus on belonging and inclusion versus diversity with straight white undergraduates in the US. And we found that people were slightly, it's not a huge effect, but slightly more likely to endorse belonging over diversity in organizational initiatives. And then this is a slightly more complex graph, but what we expected here was that if there's maybe a motivation that's focused on maintaining the racial hierarchy, brushing marginalization under the rug, what we'll see is that people who are high in identity blindness will be more likely to endorse belonging over diversity. And that is essentially what we see here. So among the people who are, so if you look at that right side of the graph, so for people who endorse belonging over diversity more, that's stronger for people who are high in identity blind beliefs. I won't show you this, but it's also higher for people who endorse anti-egalitarian attitudes, suggesting preliminary evidence for sort of some focus on sort of maintaining the current hierarchy. And we find that even when controlling for need to belong, and also we don't see that same pattern with need to belong. So it's not clear it's necessarily focused on wanting to belong yourself, but maybe on some more pernicious sort of attitudes. So it's not your own belonging needs, but desire to potentially maintain the hierarchy that might be motivating some people to focus on belonging and inclusion over diversity. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have time for one or two questions. Aurora, I'll come with the mic. Short questions.
I was wondering why would organizations choose for this the more identity blind option?
Yep.
Yeah, so why would organizations choose for the more identity blind option? We think that it's a norm now to focus on diversity and difference. It's almost like you look really bad if you don't, and there's some new, not yet published data showing that you look really bad if you don't talk about diversity and difference. So again, we think it might be a hidden motivation to not care about marginalization, but look like you do and fit with the norms of the times, essentially, yeah.
Yeah, and one more question on the left.
I'm Sliman from EY. From EY. Very interesting. In order to avoid what you have said about belonging and identities, we are trying to push belonging while also putting emphasis on intersectionality. It has not been mentioned in presentation. How would that balance the blending of the identities?
Great question.
So how would intersectionality play into all of this? Yes. Well, that also depends on how you define intersectionality. So some people define intersectionality as any intersecting identities. I define intersectionality as focused on having multiple stigmatized identities. So if you define it that way, I would say, okay, intersectionality is about being a queer woman, so how gender interacts with your queer identity, and so I think this would essentially apply to that definition as well. If you're focused more on intersectionality, just any in sort of interaction of identities, then that does get a little bit more complicated, right? Because then you're kind of bringing non-marginalized identities into this, which, yeah, is complicated with thinking about this. So we'd have to look into that a little bit more to know, yeah.
But I could imagine that when someone has an intersectional identity, they would appreciate the intersectionality also being mentioned in the statements.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we've coded for intersectionality in the statements, we don't see a lot of organizations explicitly mentioning intersectionality. So it will be in a sense that people will give examples of identities that are intersectional, but they don't always explicitly mention intersectionality. It's a really small proportion of statements that do that currently.
Hi, I'm Frederique. I was interested, you look at the statements that are on websites. How does the statement correlate with the initiatives that are actually going on in the organization? Because I sometimes see that from a risk aversion perspective, companies choose to have a broad statement, but if you look at what they're doing, there's less color blindness than might be apparent from that statement. And I was wondering how you look at that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've looked at it a little bit. So we don't have, this is a lot of organizations, and, we do not have access to all these organizations, but we did do more extensive coding of their websites. And I'm pretty sure we also found that if you have this broadened definition of diversity, you're also less likely to mention specific initiatives you have for marginalized groups, but there is more information often on the website. If we also code the full website, we find a slightly smaller proportion of statements we would consider broadened, but it's still the majority of organizations that have the broad definition if we look more into the initiatives they use.
And what we see in the data of the Netherlands Inclusivity Monitor is actually that employees don't perceive their organizations as identity conscious as the HR professionals who implement policy think their policy is. And Jon's research here, Jon Bokern, who's in the room, on diversity policy support, there we also see that people often don't have a clue about the D&I policy in their organization. So there's also a big role for information there. To make that land with employees. And we can talk about it more after the symposium. Thank you, Teri. One more applause. I'll also share some insights, also to show you what our research group is doing in this realm. And I want to start with a short demonstration. I'm not going to make you go through it, but I'll just tell you what we tend to find when we do this in organizations. And I ask the audience often what is the first thing that comes to mind when they see these three people and what the similarities are between these three. And they write it down or they keep it in their head, and I give them 1 minute for that. And then I show them these pictures, and I ask them to do the same, to write down the first thing that comes to mind. And interestingly, when they do this, we tend to see, on average, that when they see these three pictures, the audience usually, first of all, sees them as women, the similarity as women, as actresses, and to some degree as blonde. So some people also mention blonde as a similarity. Whereas with these women, with these people, they tend to first and foremost mention that they're black. That's the first similarity that comes to mind. And I show you this because it's a nice demonstration of what Peter Haggerty, a social psychology and a psychologist in the UK, has already shown in his research that people are blind to the norm category. So we do not notice the norm, and that actually directs a lot of how we interact at work. So he, in his research, showed that when presented with pictures of white men, people do not notice their skin color or their gender, whereas people see skin color but not gender when they see pictures of black men. And as we've just seen, when I show you pictures of white women, my audiences often notice that they're women but not that they're white. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. And this inattention to the norm category is, sets in motion this mechanism, or is related to this mechanism, that things that then are different really become remarkable or stand out. So people who deviate from this male, white, heterosexual, cisgender, and able-bodied norm. And when we think about the heterosexual, cisgender norm in organizations, you might think, well, you know, but sexual orientation isn't really important to the workplace. It's not really relevant, right? It's something that is private and, yeah, that we do not bring to the workplace. But of course, we know in much research, including the research of my group, that that's not true. People build relationships with our colleagues. They share about their personal lives with our colleagues. So even if sexual orientation isn't directly related to the task at hand, and sometimes it is, right? But even in those organizations where it isn't, it's actually very important to your performance. It's important to your well-being and thus to the organization. But because there's this view that one's sexual orientation is not relevant, there is this implicit and sometimes even explicit hetero-professional norm, this idea that to be professional is to be straight. And I think this picture really nicely represents how you can try to fit in this mold, right? But you still want to feel authentic. So if you're only focusing on belonging, you're missing a focus on authenticity. And that has serious repercussions. And my PhD student, Hao Zhou, focuses on this, the manifestations of heteroprofessionalism at work. And what she looked at in a sample of UK residents is how this plays out at different levels. So what she sees is that LGBTIQ+, the sample was more specific, LGBT+ employees at the behavioral level, so they they're more reluctant to share about their sexual orientation at work. At the emotional level, they feel more negative when they think about sharing or expressing their sexual orientation at work. And also at the identity level, they experience more conflict between their professional identity and their sexual identity compared to non-LGBT+ employees. So here we see that group actually makes a difference for their work sexual identity conflict. And just to give that a little bit more weight, we all have many different identities, right? So as a Dutch person and a mother, for example, these things for me align. There's no conflict between them. But a sexual identity and a professional identity conflicts more for LGBT+ people at work than for non-LGBT+ people. And not just that, it also has repercussions for their well-being. So more conflict means lower inclusion, sense of inclusion, both belonging and authenticity, and also lower satisfaction, which in turn is related to turnover intentions, to work-related stress, and to lower performance. Now, importantly, what Hao also finds is that when people perceive the organization to actually value differences, value diversity, we do not find these differences, or they're at least reduced, between LGBT+ and non-LGBT+ participants. Right, so this, I think, is really the crux. We see that it moderates it. We see it mitigates this difference. So in a climate where diversity is celebrated, work sexual identity conflict is reduced and the differences between the groups are reduced. So the important follow-up question is, of course, how do we then create such a climate? How can we influence these perceptions that the organization is actually inclusive? Well, we've already heard from Teri a little bit about this. But also Schuttich focuses on this. So in Schuttich's research, we make a distinction between identity blindness and identity conscious approaches, and we're interested in what this does to LGBT+ employees. I'm gonna just put this here and then move on because we've heard about these two approaches, and Schuttich is the one who's doing this research, and his research question is, how do LGBTQ+ employees in his research actually perceive organizations' approach, either in their messaging or in the diversity policies that they develop and implement. And now we all, of course, before we enter organizations, have all these different things that are in our heads, right? We have expectations. We might think about how quickly are we going to get promoted, our salaries, what are they gonna be like, what are my colleagues gonna be like. But we also know that people from marginalized groups have additional considerations. How are they going to respond to my identity? Teri already said a little bit about this. These are called social identity contingencies. So they're the range of vulnerabilities and the opportunities that people expect to face based on their identities. And they can come in different forms, and they are derived from the cues that people get from the organization. Sometimes the physical cues, like which pictures are on the wall, how am I being treated, what is being said, what is the diversity statement. So all these additional considerations. Am I gonna be safe? And what Jojanneke did is he looked at the literature, because it is a little bit messy, and together with Seval, who's his second supervisor, we tried to make sense of this, and we see 3 clusters of mechanisms. So one is that the identity is valued, one is that the identity is welcomed, and one is that there are no hindrances as a result of one's identity. So authenticity, belonging, and justice. These are the things that people assume based on the cues that they get from their environment. And the organization, of course, can influence this, right? So this is how it relates, I think, to practice. Is so what are the things that you as an organization should then be thinking about? And in his work, we presented participants with identity consciousness and identity blindness, and we hypothesized that identity blindness would come across as signaling a heteroprofessional or heteronormative environment, whereas the identity conscious approach would signal identity safety. And he researched this in a sample, well, several studies actually, but this one is of 407 UK LGBTQ+ participants who completed a study online. And they were asked to read a diversity statement. So it's quite similar to the setup that Teri described, where they only saw one of 2. So it was either an identity conscious or an identity blind statement, where in the one, it was really about the similarities between individuals, and the other, it was about differences. Then we asked them how attractive they perceived the organization to be. With these types of questions, this company would be a good place to work, or to be attractive for me as a place for employment. And what we find here is that the LGBTQ+ participants indeed rated the organization as more attractive in the consciousness condition than in the blindness condition. Now, the blindness condition wasn't altogether negative, right? It's still neutral. People are scoring on average of around a 4 on a 7-point scale. But consciousness definitely more positively. And in another study, he also found that this is because they perceive or anticipate this organization to be more fair, to be a place where they can belong and where they can be themselves. He didn't only look at what people would anticipate, he also looked at what employees actually experience, so how they perceive the approach of their organization. This was not an experiment, these were survey questions, and found similar results. So whether you present them with it or you just ask them how they experience what their organization does, we see the same pattern. We also see that this relates to turnover intentions. So people are actually more willing to leave or more thinking about leaving the organization due to these processes in organizations where they perceive the approach to be more blind. So that's what it signals to LGBTQ+ participants. We're continuing this line of work. We're also interested in what do HR professionals think about this, what are their considerations when they design their policies in a way, what are the hindrances to perhaps doing it in a more identity conscious way, and how are these efforts perceived by employees. So to be continued. And Birgit van Winnen, who's also here, is working in her project on how the perceptions of the organization's approach and one's own preferences, because there is, of course, a diversity of ideas about this also among LGBTQ+ participants, how they interact and how they develop over time. So she can look over time at how people perceive the policy, the approach of their organization, what their own ideology in that sense is, how that changes, and whether the change in their ideology is also influenced by the approach that the organization, or changes in the approach that the organization uses. This is in progress, so I hope that next year perhaps we can talk about that research and I can update you on that. And that's it. I'm not gonna leave any time for questions. You know where to find me, and we can talk more during the coffee and the tea. I want to actually ask the panel to come here so that we can reflect on what has been heard and on good practices in their organizations. So thank you for listening. And Jojanneke will take over the lead from me. And I'm inviting up here Marijn, Lisbeth, Jason, but also Teri, if you don't mind, for the academic perspective. We have a spot for you, and you can already start, and I will get some glasses of water for everyone. Yeah? Do you want this one? Yeah, just turn it on.
Right, can everyone hear me with this? Perfect. Well, hello everyone, I'm Shataj. I'm a PhD student of Jojanneke. She's already introduced me and some of my work. And today I'll be moderating this panel session where we'll talk about allyship, which is also an important aspect of working in an organization, because of course as a marginalized group, you can't do everything alone. Before that, I thought maybe we can start with introductions of who you are and what you do in your organization, maybe starting from Jason.
Yeah, sure.
Oh yeah, it's green. Hi, my name is Jason Yee. I work at Deloitte as a consultant in the DEI field, but I also wanted to pursue my career back into academia, so I'm also doing a PhD research with the Purdue University on inclusive behaviors and what organizations can do to stimulate them. Yeah, very excited to be here, so thank you for the invitation.
Proceed? Okay, thank you. Oh, don't sorry. We have to get accustomed a little bit to the technical aspects. I'm Lisbeth van der Gaarde. I'm working at UWV, the Dutch organization, governmental organization on social services for people who can't work or have no work at a special time. It's a very process-oriented organization, and I'm working as manager on diversity and inclusion. And we're getting through all these difficulties you showed us, Tori, broadening or not broadening, specifying or not specifying. So I'm very delighted to be here and to have heard you.
My name is Marijn Pijnenburg. I'm with IBM. I cover IBM's marketplace diversity efforts. In my role, I connect with many of our customers, speak at events, also oversee IBM's partnership sponsorships and D&I commitments. And I try to stay really focused on the progress that we're making on D&I and what we can do to become more equitable and equal in society.
And I'm Teri. You already know me, I think.
Right. Well, thank you for introducing yourself. I think the best place to start is, as Lisbeth already mentioned, you recognize some of the things that were already talked about in the presentation. Maybe as people who are working in these organizations, you can sort of talk to us what you relate to, what struggles you're facing that were brought up in the organization. Maybe starting with Lisbeth, since you started us off.
Okay, I started. Well, I think you made it very clear to me, so thank you for that, because we're struggling with people who want to who seem to be very kind and also very supporting the D&I activities, but then they ask me, well, how about it, pluriformity? Can we change diversity into a pluriformity? That would suit me much better. And then I can't say no, because intentions are not bad, and everybody needs a place, and we want to be for everybody in the Netherlands who is coming to us in our on the financial issues people have. So what should I do? And then I just say, well, we just focus on four themes, the main themes. Women, people from cultural diverse background, more disabled people, and youngsters. That's our four themes, at the primarily focusing themes. And then there is a conflict, and that's very interesting. And I don't know where it will bring us. And I think we have both. We need both elements to get further. And I'm puzzling. Just right now, we have a difficulty on a nice work of Christine. we put it on our screens, on our internet, and people are very much against our our issue on that. I'm going to talk to them, but it's a difficult discussion because we are there as well. We need to be heard as well. We are excluded if you include some people, or you like to be an ally of some specific group. That's where we are at. So.
Maybe then Jason, because you're also researching inclusivity, which you both get from the presentation as well as perhaps from your own research that comes up in your own work.
Yes, how it comes up in my work. Yeah, I really appreciate the work from Teri and also the presentation, because I think if we look at, I think organizations and what we see is that indeed the language we use around what we actually mean with it's something that we as human beings, we have language, we can communicate concepts with each other. But I think what often happens is we sometimes create miscommunications because we have different interpretations of one and the same phenomenon. So the language we use is very important, and I think that research already showed it. I think what really resonated with me as well is that I think one point you said, including everyone is sometimes actually not leading to inclusion for everyone. So I think that is also something that I see in the work that I do. Sometimes it is sort of the holy grail. If we just keep including everyone, then that should be our goal. But then actually we are stepping maybe over power relations or the power dynamics that exist within society or within organizations. I also really like the work of, I think it was a review specifically by Van Dijk, which is my promoter, but reproducing inequalities in organizations, that organizations are also not just objective, but they are always in a specific context. And if we do not actively do something, they will only reproduce inequalities that exist.
That's a very good point, I think. And I imagine for you working at Deloitte and also doing this research, you can really bring a lot of stuff into your work. And on that note, Marijn, as someone who's working on diversity in IBM, how do these themes, do you recognize them? Do you recognize these patterns in your work as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I find it so interesting to learn about new approaches, terminology, the research that you've been doing, because this gives really academic background models to us as companies who maybe focus on the practical aspects. But the key learnings, and what I recognize, is that you have to both focus on diversity as well on inclusion. That you have to focus on all minority groups and communities, as well as creating this inclusive culture where it's more about diversity of thought, experience, but also, for example, on well-being. Because there are aspects that even us feel different maybe every day when coming to work, and that well-being is also an important part. But what I also think is so important, and I think we're going to discuss that later, is how to include everyone in your organization in maintaining and building this inclusive culture, where actually everyone has a role, whether you feel you belong to a minority group or not, but also give it purpose. And I think we at IBM defined a purpose to advocate for equality, equal opportunities, but not just inside your organization, but also like in society. I mean, we work with customers, we work all around the world, and our purpose is to create a better world, really. But linking that purpose to also a commitment to diversity and inclusion, that's where the allyship comes in, and we invite everyone to be allies. So, yeah, I think I recognize some of the practical things that we do linked to this great research.
I think that's again a great transition into what this panel is all about, allyship, but that you bring up, and I feel like it's a common theme that everyone, as both researchers and people who work in organizations, always notice is there's something that organizations are doing, and like, oh, those are the nice research terms, and that's nice to learn about the theory, and as researchers, we're like, what are the organizations actually doing sometimes? And that gap is always like, we should try to fill that gap, but it's still an ongoing process, it seems. But because you led us so nicely into the fact that including everyone also includes including the people from majority, and one way to do that is to include them as allies, to make them advocates, to make them part of the movement of including minorities. And I guess to start us off with that, I was wondering if maybe all of you could sort of reflect on what being an ally means to you personally. Maybe starting with Teri, perhaps.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, being an ally is really about, not just paying lip service to DEI, but making sure we actually have the structures in place. I mean, there's being an ally, I guess, at an organizational level. What does the organizational need to do versus also what you as an individual can do? And I think it's about, yes, really creating inclusive environments, but ensuring that those inclusive environments are also tailored to people from minoritized groups, right? So kind of with the research I was talking about, ensuring that we don't just think, oh, this is such an inclusive environment, but the people who are saying that are the majority dominant group members who would have an easier time fitting in any way. So it's about really supporting people with those marginalized identities, both in terms of our day-to-day interactions with them, but also having the structures in place to support them.
Maybe Marijn, you can also, I think we can just go in a row about what being an ally means. I feel like we get then a large definition of what different people define as being an ally. I think it's good to start us off for this panel.
Yeah, I think an ally is a mindset, really. But the most important thing that I recognize, and what we see, is about learning and listening. About not owning a conversation, but just listen, try to understand, place yourself in someone else's position, listen about someone else's perspectives, issues, and then understand what you can do, and what you can do also for people within your own community group, perhaps, like also within LGBT, what could you do for people in another part of the community, or just in general, maybe part of your community in different areas of the world. Because it's also about using then your voice, a powerful voice as an ally, and being actionable and also kind of accountable with all that knowledge that you gain, all the things that you learned, understand what it is that you can do and try to be as effective as possible in that.
Oh, I rather can't put something new on the table, but to me, an ally should be sensitive. Sensitivity is something we tend to lose, and if we are not sensitive, then we can stop with all our nice things about methods on equal opportunities, etc. And that's important too. That's what I do as well as a D&I professional. I try to make an inclusive structure in all kind of HR systems and communication ways. But you need to be sensitive, because otherwise you take this path and somebody or some groups or someone says, it's not for me, you don't hear me. You have to be sensitive. And on the other side, you have to be sensitive on what other people think on what you're doing. And so you have to find a path sometimes which you didn't expect to have. So that's...
Yeah, for me to add, I think, for me, allyship is something about proactive voicing against, I think, inequalities, and really be actively advocating for fairness. And I think I fully agree with being open and understanding, because it's also inviting other perspectives in proactively. So, for example, we have in our leadership program, we have a reverse mentorship, which is actually making someone from, for example, our employee resource groups, or maybe even someone who just entered the organization, that we couple them to someone in a leadership position, with the leader actually being the mentee, or the one who is actually going to learn from this experience. And what it does is it puts someone else with a lived experience from a marginalized group, or from at least a different perspective, we try to give them the opportunity then to learn. And it's not about mentorship. They're not going to mentor and say, this is how you're going to be successful in this organization. But it's really about what can you actually learn, and can you invite another perspective in from someone else who has other lived experience. For me, that is also part of that allyship, trying to bring those alternative perspectives in and genuinely try to understand where someone is coming from or sees the world.
I think a mentorship program like that is something I've not heard of, and I think that's quite an interesting way where you can bring both allyship in a more organizational format, which becomes it's not just something that's done informally, but more in the formal structures of an organization. And beyond, of course, the reverse mentorship, I was wondering if either of you have experience with or struggled with how you bring allyship into the organization as structurally, so that people are almost kind of have to be an ally, or it's not just something that they can opt out of, perhaps. How do you structurally include allyship in an organization? Marijn, I was wondering if you have some insights about that, and what IBM is doing perhaps with that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it really resonates on what we've been focusing on the last years. Previous years on the Be Equal approach, but now we actually call for all IBMers to be allies. It's called our All In campaign. And we really ask everyone to build on the inclusive culture, but also to learn about other people, minority groups included, with help from specific BRGs that are focusing on different communities in different areas of the world, whether it's LGBT or in the US, Black or Hispanic or neurodiverse and others. There's so many differences that people can learn. And we feel people feel enriched if they learn more about those communities and those different individuals. But make also a link to, again, this advocacy within the company, but also in the environment where we operate in. And this gives this additional purpose that resonates really well with my colleagues, and people feel engaged, they feel empowered, and they feel really able to make a difference. And yeah, this campaign is just very successful, and we see so much increased engagement, activities, commitment. So it's really making a difference.
It's wonderful to hear that like these things are happening now in organizations. They are making a difference. Elizabeth, do you notice something similar in your work?
Well, I can put something to it. What we experience is that people just struggle how to be inclusive or how to see each other's in a different way. So we're not as far as IBM, I guess, but we try to train groups or to talk with groups, to have sessions with groups, how to formulate for themselves their inclusion code. What do you need? What do you take as a rule for yourself as a group to be more inclusive? And when talking on that and helping them with several angles, then people realize that there is a lot to do amongst themselves, first of all. So that's the first kind of step. And to make it very basic and practical helps people to feel a little bit successful when starting. They're not so bad at all. That's what I feel as well. That's nice. They're not offended to the issue. But I think that those first steps have to be made before I can ask somebody to be an ally for a marginalized group. Sometimes they choose them by themselves, but then they just fail on another part. So the first steps are baby steps, but they are there.
No, I think that, as you said, being an ally, of course, especially if you don't know anything about this and you don't know anything about any of these terms or what you're doing, it does take baby steps. It does take a slow progress into, both first becoming perhaps an ally at work and then also outside of it, which makes me wonder if you have insights about what might stop someone from becoming an ally, or as we see currently, there's this whole sort of pushback against diversity. So what are the things that come up that, what are the obstacles that could come in the way of someone becoming an ally, both in and outside of work, whether you've noticed some patterns occurring in your own work. Jason?
I think there are different ways to approach it as well. I think you can approach it from the organization and looking at a people perspective. I think what tends to happen a lot, maybe also looking at initiatives that we have, we try to sometimes be focused only on trying to change people. And what I mean with that is we try to make us aware of unconscious biases, we try to do trainings on be more inclusive. But then I think there's also a lot to say that we can actually change organizations. That is relatively easier, I think, because we all are humans, we all are biased, we're going to keep those biases, but we can mitigate it. But what I mean with organizations is, for example, Deloitte is a multinational, so we operate in countries also where LGBTQ+ is condemned or illegal even. So what we did, we made at least a commitment in our organization policies as well, that we said, within the walls of our organization, no matter what the context actually is, within these walls, you are safe, you're going to be safe, you're not going to be discriminated if you're LGBTQ+. And I think these initiatives that we really made it in our policies visibly and explicitly as an organization, also towards our community, and also that we say if you are LGBTQ+ in one of those countries, we are going to look if you can be transferred, if your safety is really in danger, if you feel like you're not safe there. And I think having these kind of policies, but also other small policies that really make it explicit that you're also really saying these are the things that we do not accept within the walls of our organizations, can also be a form of allyship, I feel. Because besides, I think, making sure you're not accepting exclusionary, discriminatory behaviors, on top of that, there's also about what you promote, so what kind of behaviors do you promote then? And this is all within then policies, and which may seem really boring sometimes, but these are the things as well that people are going to read. People need to follow those rules as well, which also I think is a way of viewing allyship, I would say, besides promoting, of course, and voicing it on an individual level.
Yeah, I think that's, especially with a multinational organization, that's probably a common thing that comes across, not just for LGBTQ+, but of course for various different demographic identities. And I was wondering, because Elizabeth, you were sort of in the talking about like the people who take babies. You're taking people along with it, but I'm sure while you're taking people along, and since you have all these four dimensions, you must see the obstacles that come up and why people perhaps resist this.
Yes, we see the obstacles, and we, in June, our board made a small video against discrimination and racism, and people, we organized it together with people from the integrity team, and also from our network of people from cultural diversity. And those people, they said to us, finally, my employer is coming behind me. Finally, my employer is standing up for me, and some of them were crying. And then that's not just because, you are a very sensitive person, but people just finally felt we're in. You are seeing me. We are being heard. Then there are also other people who are very opposite to this whole enterprise, and said, why should our board get into politics, or just tell me that I have I have to act differently, or is accusing me for maybe something I don't or do. But so you have really stand up, and also the board has to stand up for people, just to make people feel they need to be there, they're welcome there, and something is not acceptable or not allowed, or just behind anything. People are opposing to becoming an ally, or fear of becoming an ally, also because they have their own peer group, and they might feel not comfortable to do things or to be explicitly doing things because of their peers, or people are not feared, but they don't like to come for somebody else, to stand up for somebody else. Sorry, because of they don't know what other people will say, or they are minding their own businesses. So the uncomfortable feeling, you have to help people to get from that, just to try and to ask them, how do you feel right now? That might overcome a little bit and bring you in those next steps.
That's a good point, especially what you bring up about people with their friends and maybe they don't want to speak up, which I think brings us to a very important aspect of allyship, which is privilege. And everyone has certain privileges and certain perhaps stigmatized identities. And I wonder how you conceptualize privilege in your model of allyship, in the way allyship occurs. Marijn, what does IBM do, or how do you see it personally?
Yeah, and it's an interesting concept, a privilege, and we connect it to covering, because even people that are from a majority group that have certain privileges might cover certain aspects, but it's giving them a role, giving them purpose, in making them interested in learning about other people, building this empathy. That's essential. Coming slightly back to the previous question, is as a company, as an organization, also support that, and not support that just in words, but also in actions. So if allies come up with certain recommendation or points, really get into action as an organization as well. Because if you don't support it as an organization, people will not do that. And I think the other point is there's a kind of maturity model around allyship as well. And during the WorkplacePride conference, Matt Ersby from Shell wonderfully explained on the certain levels that you have to go through. And it's not about being perfect as an ally. You don't have to be perfect at all, as long as you are committed. And then you can start from scratch in being interested, in being open to learning, up to the last step is actively ally for equal legislation and other things. But this concept, I think, is really important for the majority group, for the privileged group, and also understanding that has a bit of a negative connotation maybe with some people, because they don't experience it, they don't see it, they don't recognize it. And it's then about creating this awareness in a positive way, engaging them and that they can actually do something. That is very helpful.
I think that's true that whenever you use the word privilege, people sort of, again, have a reaction to it, which is it's seen as it's a negative thing that you have privilege, which isn't necessarily true. It doesn't have to have a negative connotation. It's just a fact of life that happens, and that's something that should be acknowledged, and from there on you can move forward and perhaps be a better ally. I was wondering, Jason, perhaps what you've experienced with regards to privilege, and also with regards to perhaps the allyship you've seen or experienced yourself while working at Deloitte. Your personal experiences with it.
Yeah, I think the thing with privilege is if you haven't experienced it that much, I think just that invisibility is already a privilege. If you haven't experienced discrimination because of your skin color, if you haven't experienced discrimination because you're a man, I think that is already, something within privilege, which makes it also sometimes uncomfortable for people. But like initiatives, I think, for like reverse mentorship, those are the things that are going to at least push you a little bit out of your lived experience to try and see, okay, how do you experience our policies, our workforce, or just working in a context. For example, if I do not have the experience of being catcalled on the streets, for example, but I oftentimes with my partner have a nice discussion. My partner is almost 2 meters long, white, from Gooi, from the Hilversum area. But we have interesting discussions, especially in the beginning of our relationship, because I was noticing a lot more things that were happening. People were looking at us just 1 second longer because we're interracial, multiracial, whereas my partner said, but I don't see it. And also because he's 2 meters long, he also didn't experience What I sometimes have, if I do walk on the streets with my fascinating nail polish and sometimes even heels, that just being looked at, that experience can also be triggering. If you do not have the experience, that you do not have to worry about your physical safety on the streets, I sometimes explain as well, that's also privilege. But then it's indeed, like Marijn said also, how can you then use your power that you have in order to raise more awareness for it? Because I think it starts with awareness. If we are not aware of lived experiences of other people, we also cannot change anything. So I think that awareness is where it really starts and becoming an ally, but then that empathy is also really important to really start having that conversation.
No, I think I'm sure it's something that many of us in this room can resonate with things that you notice and things that you don't, or when you're talking to someone who has a different lived experience, you realize like, oh, there's stuff that I didn't know was happening, but is happening in fact for other people. I think that also it might be a great place to close this session on allyship, to sort of reflect and realize that we have some questions. I'm not sure if we have time for those, unfortunately, because
I think that we have the coffee and tea break to really chat with each other. So why don't we do that?
I think then that might be best
nice
to do that during the break, because I think from here we can sort of take away that, it's important to recognize your own privilege and be, even as someone who's marginalized, you can be an ally for a different marginalized group, because there's always more allies needed. And I think with that, I will end this panel session. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
And then I'll give the final word to Jojanneke and Michiel.
Actually, first to Michiel, because we have a few minutes left to open the academic year. Just stay seated, it's no problem, because we will be ending soon. But thank you very much for sharing your insights. And I do invite everyone to talk to them during the coffee and tea break, and to share your own experience with each other, right, for empathy building.
Great. Yes, so this is a bit of a double act. We do have a scientific conference and a panel, but we're also opening our own academic at WorkplacePride year. And so quickly, because I heard some people ask, what is it all about? Academia at WorkplacePride, we have a mission and a vision. So, and you see in it, it's a sense of belonging, of course, of us, the LGBTIQ plus community in our workplace. We also acknowledge that universities, research organizations are unique. They are different from government organizations or commercial organizations, and we should definitely address that in a positive way. And we have this great connection about building up knowledge. What we do, for instance, here, what we do with all of you, and what we do with Jojanneke. So what do we do this year? So we started actually with together with Tech at WorkplacePride, a company visit to the TU Delft. I saw there were some people from Delft here, where we looked at diversity in the building environment. We had our own dedicated roundtable during our conference, which you see here in the middle. And we had actually quite recently at LUMC, not far from here, part of Leiden Pride, together with Women Academia, the power of women in the age of super diversity. And it was also actually, I think there, the rector from Erasmus University announced there was a overarching pride group of both Rotterdam, Leiden and Delft, which has taken place. And of course we have this symposium right here. We do have plans for the rest of the year. So on Coming Out Day, Twente symposium is taking place about happiness and pride. So I hope you all travel to Enschede in the afternoon. Then we have our WorkplacePride Impact Award Gala, and there's a special part in the program for the communities, including academia at WorkplacePride. So I hope you'll all come to het Scheepvaartmuseum in Amsterdam. And we're also gearing up together with Young at WorkplacePride and Tech at WorkplacePride, I see Maral not already, for Purple Friday, which is actually an annual event. We had a bit of a brainstorm what we're going to do next year, and I'm going to ask you later to, not here, but by email to vote. But just to give you a bit of a flavor of the topics we would like to put on the agenda, and we realize we cannot do all 6. So one of them is self-ID. Many organizations are struggling about this, so we want to kind of map out who belongs to the LGBT community and how do they experience working at the university. The other is a discussion about the pride flag. It also came up. We have the traditional pride flag. There is the progress pride flag. What is the discussion around this in our academic environment? How do we deal with rainbow families? So also at universities, what are the rules, for instance, about parental leave? We had a very interesting one about virtual reality and gender identity. So research is being done in Delft, so people who's transgender or non-binary, and you can kind of experience this in a virtual reality way. And there's also a virtual reality lab at Saxion, so maybe we will do even a visit there so you can all participate. Then there's one thing about politics and queer academic community. Actually, this year and next year, there are going to be 50 key elections taking place around the world. They all have an impact on us as a queer community, also at academia. So what are the implications? And then finally, do we want a dedicated HR session about parental leave, about transition leave, around the HR systems and how they support different names, etc. Maybe you can even bring your HR director or your HR ally to that session. Anyway, 6 plans we have, and so we'll by email kind of vote and see what we're going to put on the agenda for 2024. And so I think I declare our academic year officially open here as well. I give the floor back to Jojanneke.